Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pause for Pedagogy, a conversation with Natasha Chapman and Nalia Kaya discussing digital stories and leadership education and centering on the voices of students with the International Leadership Association. My name is Dan Jenkins, and I'm Chair and Associate Professor of Leadership and Organizational Studies at the University of Southern Maine and co-editor of Pause for Pedagogy. The ILA and I are thrilled to welcome Natasha and Nalia to our latest conversation in the Pause for Pedagogy series. So welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
You're welcome. I'm excited to have this conversation. So a little bit about Natasha. So she served as a leadership educator, practitioner, and administrator in higher ed for about 15 years, and as the coordinator for leadership studies at the University of Maryland and College Park. She provides direction and support to the design and delivery of undergraduate courses and the leadership studies minor and certificate there. Her scholarly interests include critical perspectives in leadership education, leadership educator identity, and transformative learning. She received her BS in Human Services from Black Hills State University and MA in Educational Administration, and her PhD in Ed Leadership and Higher Ed, both from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And Nalia Kaya, she's an assistant professor of sociology at Montgomery College, there at Tacoma Park in Silver Spring, and she previously served as the coordinator for multicultural and Native American, Indian, and Indigenous student involvement and advocacy at the University of Maryland, where she also facilitated the TOTUS Spoken Word Experience program and coached their college union's poetry slam team. As an educator, Nalia utilizes poetry as a medium for teaching and social change and encourages students to utilize artistic expression as they examine their own identity, beliefs, and values as a form of activism. Well, what a great set of skills and experiences from both of you, which certainly helps to guide and shape the article that y'all have beautifully written and set us up for this conversation. So Natasha and Nalia, what were some of the key questions that you were hoping to answer when you were writing this article?
Some key questions. I think when I started thinking about writing, the main thing was, how do you implement? So you can talk about things theoretically, and you have all of these great ideas about centering voice or doing a digital story, but more the practical side, how do you actually implement incorporating students' voices? What does an assignment look like? How does this actually pan out when you implement it into the class? So I was trying to think kind of from a practical standpoint, as an educator myself, what would be really useful to me in an article.
Mm-hmm. And I think an important question to also ask, especially in the context of this particular manuscript, is the implications for leadership, the leadership for what. Digital stories, counter stories can be used in a lot of different spaces, even outside of leadership education. And so trying to make that connection to how it fits within some of the pedagogy that's already used in leadership education, or at least some of the more recent pedagogical trends in leadership education, and so that we can also make sense of this tool within the work that we do.
Right. Yeah, and so I know that, leadership educators, we certainly tend to be pretty progressive and certainly like to experiment with experiential forms of education and active learning. And, I love this idea of using various forms of art and media in order to express oneself, to learn more deeply about their capacities to lead or roles, could be followership roles, any time that they're interacting with others in an organization and a leader or follower role. And we have so many tools available to us, but one of the things you mentioned in the article is, while folks might be digital natives, it doesn't mean that the instructor or the students can just jump right in and utilize the tools. So tell me a little bit more about the digital storytelling practice or pedagogy, and where did the idea come from? Where was the need for this work as you see it, and how do you articulate it and facilitate that?
Well, I might have maybe Nelia, if you want to talk a little bit about just your own kind of own philosophy of teaching, because I know it has to do a lot with storytelling, and then I can share a little bit more about how it's been incorporated into our leadership studies program.
Yeah, so I was teaching the multiracial leadership course in the leadership studies program that Natasha kind of oversees. And so for me, writing the self into work is really important for students to see how their lives connect to theories and to leadership, and to be able to apply what they're learning, but also to learn and understand maybe the intersections of their experiences, but also the differences of their life experiences. And so for me, that just was really something that was important in the classroom, bringing their whole self to the class and being able to see how their stories connected with the material. And I found that it was extremely powerful. And in fact, we would share them at the end of the semester, but students kept saying how much or how beneficial it would have been to have heard some of the stories earlier, which is why we kind of switched to starting to share stories midway through, because they started to make a lot of connections with one another as friends, as peers. It built a class community, trust and collaboration. And then it also just really increased their understanding of the material. And it really helped them to think critically about the material, because now it wasn't just some abstract material, it was their life, it was their experiences, it was their peers' experiences. And so that's kind of the significance of it for me, and particularly in that classroom.
Mm-hmm. And the use of digital stories in leadership studies here at Maryland actually was happening before I got here. I've been here about 4 years, but I do think that how we're using the tool has evolved over time. And again, I think also aligns with some of the emerging trends. I think I would say trends to leadership education, but perhaps not to other disciplines around kind of critical perspectives on leadership. And so initially in our capstone class, for example, it was used as an opportunity for students to communicate their leadership philosophy, how they've come to that leadership understanding over their course of their life and their time in the minor. More recently now it's we're trying to align that more with also using it as a tool to deconstruct and reconstruct what they've learned over time. So it might be to affirm some of the theories or concepts that we've learned in classes that we've talked about, or to disrupt some of those ideas by centering it on their own lived experiences. And so I think it's really good opportunities for students to really think about the evidence of what leadership means to them in the world. And so over time it's just evolved so that we can help students to use it not only as an opportunity to share what leadership means to them, but also as a tool for kind of putting a critical lens on how we're talking about leadership.
That's great. Yeah, and so much of what we do as leadership educators is, really reflected in the cycle of the, experiential learning model. It's in many ways our job and our responsibility as leadership educators to facilitate that meaning making process, as you mentioned, or sense making. And it may be, and certainly the way that you described it, more narrative in process than we might actually think. And
yes,
yeah, and so go ahead, please.
Oh no, I was going to say it's, I liken it to some of the activities that we often do in, our classroom spaces around like values, where we'll ask students to identify 10 values and then narrow it down to 5 values and then 3 and talk about how difficult that is. And so when you're asking students in just a few minutes to communicate what leadership means to them and how they value it, in just a short amount of time, and that can be a pretty powerful reflective process. They're having to pick and choose images that reflect, their leadership experiences. They might identify certain words or sounds that kind of emote something about how they feel about leadership, and they kind of go through this kind of iterative process of deciding what they want to gather and share, and then putting that all together. And so even that process alone can be quite reflective for students.
Yeah, and I think also in our identity-specific courses on leadership, whether it's multiracial or Latinx or Black leadership, it's also adding that additional layer of how your identities intersect and your positionality in society based on your various intersecting identities, and then putting that with leadership as well. So maybe why you came to this version of leadership is based on your race, your class, your right, and how those intersect in gender. And so having them to add on those layers and think about the fact that maybe your version of leadership looks like this because of your experiences based on your positionality. And I might have very different experiences, which have obviously shaped my views on leadership. And so I think those are such important discussions, and for them to learn to have those discussions across difference without it being confrontational, right? And so through the storytelling and by people seeing other people's families, the tone is very different than just two people arguing about different, standpoints on leadership.
Right, or just having an in-class discussion about it, or small groups, or I think paper or something.
Mm-hmm.
So, so you talked about positionality, identity exploration, meaning making, from different perspectives, and thinking about, the learning outcomes that are associated with the digital storytelling, and, through the practice and process, as well as, from a pedagogical or andragogical standpoint. How do you, am I missing any learning outcomes, I guess is the first part of the question. And then, the second is, well, how do you assess whether the outcomes are met?
Missing any outcomes? I'm trying to think of anything else that I would say maybe another outcome of the process is in the sharing of the digital stories too, which comes full circle in that way. And maybe even I believe one of the most important components of the cycle of creating the digital story and doing the storytelling, because it also allows students to really kind of practice some of the skills that we always encourage in our courses around perspective taking, kind of building empathy, curiosity, question posing, and so forth. And so I think there's some opportunity there to even practice skills that we've incorporated into the courses up until that point. And so that would be another outcome that we haven't addressed yet.
Okay.
I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
No, yeah, and I'm guilty of that. So what are, I was thinking about ways that you might assess whether the outcomes are met or not, because it's quite a process, and from an assessment standpoint, what are some procedures or practices that you all undertake?
Yeah, I use a rubric because it is so hard. Like, how do you assess someone's story in a way, right? So that can get really difficult, and students also can get kind of anxious around, okay, what exactly has to go in here? And so I find that the more specific you are, the more helpful it is to the student. But then it also still helps you when it comes to grading time, right? So that you're letting them know, I'm not grading you based on your experiences or the subjective kind of parts of it, but whether or not you kind of met some core things. And so for me, I'll have very specific things like 2 to 4 critical incidents were discussed. Connections were made to intersecting identities. And the portrait assesses their understanding of leadership and their incidents. It addresses who, what, where, when, why these incidents kind of took place, how that made them feel, how that affected them. And so I try to be as specific as possible because it just can be really difficult to grade kind of a narrative type of assignment, because you hear this wonderful story and then you go, how do I assess them on this, right? And so I have that rubric posted, and that's kind of what I use to go about it. And then, as Natasha mentioned, the Q&A session. So,
right.
Are they adequately addressing the questions that are posed to them? And that kind of comes in with that additional outcomes she mentioned about communication skills, public speaking, being able to engage with the audience, and also other folks, their classmates, them being able to kind of pose these great questions, connecting their experiences and what they heard. So that's another component.
Yeah, so that would be maybe a consideration that I would offer to educators who might be interested in incorporating a tool like this in their class, is to also think about how much weight you would give to the actual product itself. Especially if, you know, not all students are tech savvy or have access, or if you haven't spent time in class, to give them some resources to actually develop a really kind of really high quality product. And so again, you always emphasize that, you know, you want students to put in 100% into any assignment that they do, but I try to emphasize content and try to minimize some of the stress around the actual technology piece if I can. So giving them time in class to work on it, which also helps to give feedback and to also help students ask questions about what they might have created thus far. But there might be peers in their class that can help them with some of the technology aspects and so forth. And so if, you know, if you are using a rubric and some of the technology aspects are weighted highly, then I would just recommend that you're providing students with the tools to kind of successfully navigate that tech space.
Right, right. That's important. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, when I do this with my social problems courses in sociology, and they have to create kind of these mini social issue documentaries, I've found that students are the best at helping each other. And so they kind of have found the newest technology, and they sit there and they brainstorm, and this is how I pulled this together. And, oh, here's an idea of, you know, an interview I did with my parent or my cousin. And so I find that by giving them that space, it's really helpful, and it also has helped immensely with the end product.
Very good. Yeah, and just as, you know, using technology isn't it ends all by itself. You know, you have to. I love the way that you articulated the use of the rubric is, you know, really, you know, the critical incidents and the presentation skills and these, you know, it's such a higher order, you know, level of thinking. You know, if you think about Bloom's taxonomy or Fink's taxonomy, you're hitting a lot of different learning outcomes with the same with the one assignment, and that's fantastic. And yes, I'd agree that, you know, no matter sometimes how much you want to be a helper with some of the technology, find that students can articulate it sometimes better with one another, and certainly are aware of, you know, you may have put a whole link on your Blackboard or Coursera together about, you know, 2 or 3 different tools, and they say, oh yeah, well, we don't use that anymore, we use X and Y, you know? And you say, well, I'm glad I spent the time doing that. So but that's fantastic. So, you know, thinking about these types of learning strategies, you know, where do you see future research or writing headed in this area, and, you know, what will we all be writing about next?
Oh goodness. Well, future writing. Well, I definitely think, you know, there's going to be a lot more conversations around how we're using technology in the classroom. Right. In fact, I was going to try to pull out a book that just came out, but I'm not close enough, so I won't do that right now. But I do have a source in our manuscripts of a piece that our colleague James McShay and I just wrote that gives our capstone digital story assignment. Highlights our capstone there in that particular book. And so, but I would say in terms of my own personal writing right now, I am working on another manuscript with a colleague on using leader prototypes and exploring leader prototypes to enhance metacognition with students. And so it's still kind of applying that critical lens, but not necessarily using digital stories. And so I'll let Nelia speak real quick, and I might grab that book.
Sure. I don't have anything I'm currently working on, but usually I'm working on things for poetry publications. So working on something for Split This Rock Poetry Festival, Poems of Provocation and Witness in DC. We will both be presenting there in April. So that's usually, you kind of find me in a little bit of a different circle with a lot of my writing, but I absolutely enjoyed having the opportunity to write a piece connected to leadership and some of the things that were going on in the classroom, especially with my wonderful colleague.
Yes, yeah. And so the book I was referring to, I'll show it here, not to promote too much, but it's called Engaging Images for Research, Pedagogy, and Practice. And so there are several different chapters about the use of technology and social media in the classroom in higher education. And so I think that's just an example of the popularity of using technology in the classroom. But I guess what also comes to mind is just continuing to think about what that means for access as well. So I think that will be another conversation. Perhaps, universal design, even something like a digital story, how do we address accessibility needs when we're including things like visual and audio type artifacts? And so, can all students access those things? Can all students utilize those things or equipment, etc.? So that can be another conversation. And I guess the last piece also might just be in terms of what is the etiquette, what are policies and rules around also using a technology, using images, photos, etc. In the classroom space too. Yeah. So yeah, I think there's just a lot of different directions we can take in terms of technology in the classroom, even beyond just digital stories. So.
Right. Yeah. It's so easy today with high bandwidth and all the tools we have in our palms, in our pockets, on our desks to share any form of media from 4K high def video at 60 frames per second to just photos where we had to wait to develop these things in a lab, or even when we had Polaroids, but the opportunity to be able to do this and to let students go out in their own fields and contexts, and to make to make these connections relevant for them in ways that we never really imagined. We're still learning a lot about this, and the applications in leadership development are certainly evident, as they probably are in sociology and other fields, and certainly in art and some of the related humanities and fine arts fields. So this is exciting stuff, and I'll have to check out that book. I wrote it down as you were showing it to me. I'm gonna take a look at that, and I'm excited to see what y'all work on next, and how folks will use the practices that you've laid out. So anything else you'd like to add or share that either I missed or that you wanted to make sure to share?
No, I think that's good.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you so much, Natasha and Leah, for joining us today. Pause for Pedagogy. It's an initiative of the Leadership Education Member Interest Group of the ILA, and articles and videos are available at www.ila-net.org, and you can follow us on Twitter at @the_ILA. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.